Chapter 6. A Council of War. I awoke somewhat late on the following morning. Indeed, I was but half awake when there came a somewhat masterful and peremptory tap at my bedroom door, followed by the appearance in the room of a rather tall gentleman of some 30 years of age. I should have diagnosed him instantly as a doctor by his self-possessed, proprietary manner of entering, but he left me no time for guessing as to his identity. "Good morning, Jardine," he said briskly, jingling the keys and small change in his trousers pockets. "My name is Jervis, second violin in the Thorndyke orchestra. I'm in charge here pro tem. How are you feeling?" "Oh, I'm all right. I was just going to get up. You needn't trouble about the practice. I'm quite fit." "Glad to hear it," said Jervis, "but you'd better keep quiet all the same. My orders are explicit, and I know my place too well to disobey. Thorndyke's instructions were that you are not to make any visits or go abroad until after the inquest." "Inquest?" I exclaimed. "Yes. He's coming here at 4 o'clock to hold an inquiry into the circumstances that led to your being locked up in a cellar, and until then I'm to look after the practice and keep an eye on you. What time do you expect the offspring of the flittermouse?" "Who?" I demanded. "Batson. He's coming back today, isn't he?" "Yes. About 6 o'clock tonight." "Then you'll be able to clear out. So much the better. The neighbourhood doesn't seem very wholesome for you." "I suppose I can do the surgery work," said I. "You'd better not. Better follow Thorndyke's instructions literally. But you can tell me about the patients and help me to dispense. And that reminds me that a person named Samway called just now, a rather fine-looking woman. Reminded me of a big, sleek tabby cat. She wouldn't say what she wanted. Do you know anything about her?" "I expect she came about her account. But she'll have to see Batson. I told her so only a night or two ago." "Very well, then," said Jervis. "Then I'll be off now, and you take things easy, and just think over what happened last night so as to be ready for Thorndyke." With this he bustled away, leaving me to rise and breakfast at my leisure. His advice to me to think over the events of the previous night was rather superfluous. The experience was not one that I was likely to forget. To have escaped from death by the very slenderest chance was in itself a matter to occupy one's thoughts pretty completely, apart from the horrible circumstances. And then there was the mystery in which the whole affair was enveloped, a mystery which utterly baffled any attempt to penetrate it. Turn it over as I would, and it was hardly out of my thoughts for a minute at a time all day, no glimmer of light could I perceive, no faintest clue to any explanation of that hideous and incomprehensible crime. At 4 o'clock punctually to the minute, Dr. Thorndyke arrived, and, having quickly looked me over to see that I was none the worse for my adventure, proceeded to business. "Have you finished the visits, Jervis?" he asked. "Yes, and sent off all the medicine. There's nothing more to do until 6. "Then," said Thorndyke, "we might have a cup of tea in the consulting room and talk this affair over. I'm rather taking possession of you, Jardine," he added, "but I think we ought to see where we are quite clearly, even if we decide finally to hand the case over to the police. Don't you agree with me?" "Certainly," I agreed, highly flattered by the interest he was taking in my affairs. "Naturally, I should like to get to the bottom of the mystery." "So should I," said he, "and to that end I propose that you give us a completely circumstantial account of the whole affair. I have had a talk with your very intelligent little maid, Maggie, and now I want to hear what happened after she left you." "I don't think I have much to tell that you don't know," said I. "However, I will take up the story where Maggie left off." And I proceeded to describe the events in detail, much as I have related them to the reader. Thorndyke listened to my story with profound attention, making an occasional memorandum, but not uttering a word until I had finished. Then, after a rapid glance through his memoranda, he said, "You spoke of a note that was handed in to you. Have you got that note?" "I left it on the writing table, and it's probably there still." "Yes, here it is." I brought it over to the little table on which our tea was laid and handed it to him, and as he took it from me with the dainty carefulness of a photographer handling a wet plate, I noted mentally that the habit of delicate manipulation contracted in a laboratory makes itself evident in the most trifling of everyday actions. "I see," he remarked, turning the envelope over and scrutinizing it minutely, "that this is addressed to Dr. H. Jardine. It appears, then, that he knows your Christian name. Can you account for that?" "No, I can't. The only letter I've had here was addressed Dr. Jardine, and I've signed no certificates or other documents." He made a note of my answer, and, drawing the missive from its envelope, read it through. "The handwriting," he remarked, "looks disguised rather than illiterate, and the diction is inconsistent. The blatantly incorrect adverb at the end does not agree with the rest of the phraseology and the correct punctuation. As to the signature, we may neglect that, unless you are acquainted with anyone in these parts of the name of Parker." "I am not," said I. "Very well. Then if you will allow me to keep this note, I will file it for future reference. And now I will ask you a few questions about this adventure of yours, which is really a most astonishing and mysterious affair, even more mysterious, I may add, than it looks at the first glance. But we shall come to that presently. At the moment we are concerned with the crime itself, with a manifest attempt to murder you, and the circumstances that led up to it. And there are certain obvious questions that suggest themselves. The first is, can you give any explanation of this attempt on your life?" "No, I can't," I replied. "It is a complete mystery to me. I can only suppose that the fellow was a homicidal lunatic." "A homicidal lunatic," said Thorndyke, "is the baffled investigator's last resource, but we'd better not begin supposing at this stage. Let us keep strictly to facts. You do not know of anything that would explain this attack on you?" "No." "Then the next question is, had you any property of value on your person?" "No. £5 would cover the value of everything I had about me, including the instruments." "Then that seems to exclude robbery as a motive. The next question is, does any person stand to benefit considerably by your death? Have you any considerable expectations in the way of bequests, reversions, or succession to landed property or titles?" "No," I replied with a faint grin. "I shall come in for 1,000 or two when my uncle dies, but I believe the London Hospital is the alternative legatee, and I suppose we would hardly suspect the hospital governors of this little affair. Otherwise, the only person who would benefit by my death would be the undertaker who got the contract to plant me." Thorndyke nodded and made a note of my answer. "That," said he, "disposes of the principal motives for a premeditated murder. There remains the question of personal enmity. Not a common motive in this country. Have you, as far as you know, an enemy or enemies who might conceivably try to kill you?" "As far as I know, I have not an enemy in the world, or anyone even who would wish to do me a bad turn." "Then," said Thorndyke, "that seems to dispose of all the ordinary motives for murder, and I may say that I have only put these questions as a matter of routine precaution, ex abundantia cautelae, as Jervis says when he is in a forensic mood, because certain other facts which I have learned seem to exclude any of these motives except, perhaps, robbery from the person." "You haven't been long picking up those other facts," remarked Jervis. "Why, the affair only happened last night." "I've only made a few simple inquiries," replied Thorndyke. "This morning I called on Mr. Highfield, whose name, as solicitor and agent to the landlords, I copied from the notice on the gate at the works last night. He knows me slightly, so I was able to get from him the information that I wanted. It amounts to this. About 4 months ago, a Mr. Gill wrote to him and offered a lump sum for the use of the mineral water works for 6 months. Highfield accepted the offer and drew up an agreement, as desired, granting Gill immediate possession of the premises and the small stock and plant, of which the residue was to be taken back at a valuation by the landlords at the expiration of the term. I noted Gill's address, as it appeared on the agreement, and sent my man, Polton, to make enquiries. The address is that of a West Kensington lodging house at which Gill was staying when he signed the agreement. He had been there only 3 weeks. He left 2 days after the date of the agreement, and the landlady does not know where he went or anything about him." "Sounds a bit fishy," Jervis remarked. "Did he tell Highfield what he wanted the premises for?" "I understood that something was said about some assay work in connection with certain, or rather uncertain, mineral concessions. But of course that was no affair of Highfield's. His business was to get the rent, and, having got it, his interest in Mr. Gill lapsed. But you see the bearing of these facts. Gill's connection with these works does, as Jervis says, look a little queer, especially after what has happened. But seeing that he made his arrangements 4 months ago, at a time when Jardine had no thought of coming into this neighbourhood, it is clear that those arrangements could have no connection with this particular attempt. Gill obviously did not take those works with the intention of murdering Jardine. He took them for some other purpose, quite possibly the purpose that he stated. And we must not assume that Gill was the perpetrator of this outrage at all. Could you identify the man who let you in?" "No," I replied, "certainly not. I hardly saw him at all. The place was pitch dark, and whenever he struck a match he was either behind me or in front with his back to me. The only thing I could make out about him was that he had some sort of coarse wash leather gloves on." "Ha!" exclaimed Thorndyke. "Then we were right, Jervis." I looked in surprise from one to the other of my friends, and was on the point of asking Thorndyke what he meant, when he continued: "That closes another track. If you couldn't identify the man, a description of Gill, if we could obtain it, would not help us. We must begin at some other point." "It seems to me," said Jervis, "that we haven't much to go upon at all." "We haven't much," agreed Thorndyke, "but we still have something. We find that the motive of this attempt was apparently not robbery, nor the diversion of inheritable property, nor personal enmity. It must have been premeditated, but yet it could not have been planned more than a week in advance, for Jardine has only been in this neighbourhood for that time, and his coming was unexpected. The appearances very strongly suggest that the motive, whatever it was, has been generated recently and probably locally, so we'd better make a start from that assumption." "Is it possible," Jervis suggested, "that this man Gill may be some sort of anarchist crank, or a sort of thug? It is actually conceivable that he may have taken these premises for the express purpose of having a secure place where he could perpetrate murders and conceal the bodies." "It is quite conceivable," said Thorndyke, "and when we go and look over the works, which I propose we do presently, we may as well bear the possibility in mind. But it is merely a speculative suggestion. To return to your affairs, Jardine, has your stay here been quite uneventful?" "Perfectly," I replied. "No unusual or obscure cases? No injuries?" "No, nothing out of the common," I replied. "No deaths?" "One, but the man died before I took over." "Nothing unusual about that? Everything quite regular?" "Oh, perfectly," I answered. And then, with a sudden qualm, as I recalled Batson's uncertainty as to the actual cause of death, I added, "At least, I hope so." "You hope so?" queried Thorndyke. "Yes, because it's too late to go into the question now. The man was cremated." At this a singular silence fell. Both my friends seemed to stiffen in their chairs, and both looked at me silently but very attentively. Then Thorndyke asked: "Did you have anything to do with that case?" "Yes," I replied. "I went with Batson to examine the body." "And are you perfectly satisfied that everything was as it should be?" I was on the point of saying "yes," and then suddenly there arose before my eyes the vision of Mrs. Samway looking at me over Batson's shoulder with that strange, inscrutable expression. And again I recalled her unexplained anger and then her sudden change of mood. It had impressed me uncomfortably at the time, and it impressed me uncomfortably now. "I don't know that I am, now that I come to think it over," I replied. "Why not?" asked Thorndyke. "Well," I said, a little hesitatingly. To begin with, I don't think the cause of death was quite clear. Batson couldn't find anything definite when he attended the man, and I know that the patient's death came as quite a surprise." "But surely," exclaimed Thorndyke, "he took some measures to find out the cause of death." "He didn't. He assumed that it was a case of fatty heart and certified it as morbus cordis, and a man named O'Connor confirmed the certificate after examining the body." "After merely inspecting the exterior?" "Yes." My two friends looked at one another significantly, and Thorndyke remarked with a disapproving shake of the head: "And this is what all the elaborate precautions amount to in practice. A case which might have been one of the crudest and boldest poisoning gets past with hardly a pretence of scrutiny. And so it will always be. Routine precautions against the unsuspected are no precautions at all. That is the danger of cremation. It restores to the poisoner the security that he enjoyed in the old days when there were no such sciences as toxicology and organic chemistry, when it was impossible for him to be tripped up by an exhumation and an analysis." "You don't think it likely that this was a case of poisoning, do you?" I asked. "I know nothing about the case," he replied, "excepting that there was gross neglect in issuing the certificates. What do you think about it yourself? Looking back at the case, is there anything besides the uncertainty that strikes you as unsatisfactory?" I hesitated, and again the figure of Mrs. Samway rose before me with that strange, baleful look in her eyes. Finally I described the incident to my colleagues. "Mrs. Samway!" exclaimed Jervis. "Is that the handsome Lucretia Borgia lady with the mongoose eyes who called here this morning? By Jove! Jardine, you're giving me the creeps." "I understand," said Thorndyke, "that you are making as if to feel the dead man's pulse." "Yes." "There is no doubt, I suppose, that he really was dead?" "None whatever. He was as cold as a fish, and besides there was quite distinct rigor mortis." "That seems conclusive enough," said Thorndyke, but he continued to gaze at his open notebook with a profoundly speculative and thoughtful expression. "It certainly looks," said Jervis, "as if Jardine had either seen something or had been about to see something that he was not wanted to see, and the question is what that something could have been." "Yes," I agreed gloomily, "that is what I have just been asking myself. There might have been a wound or injury of some kind, or there might have been the marks of a hypodermic needle on the wrist. I wish I knew what she meant by looking at me in that way." "Well," said Jervis, "we shall never know now. The grave gives up its secrets now and again, but the crematorium furnace never. Whether he died naturally or was murdered, Mr. Maddock is now a little heap of ashes with no message for anyone this side of the Day of Judgment." Thorndyke looked up. "That seems to be so," said he, "and really we have no substantial reasons for thinking that there was anything wrong. So we come back to your own affairs, Jardine, and the question is, what would you prefer to do?" "In what respect?" I asked. "In regard to this attempt on your life. You have told us that you have not an enemy in the world, but it appears as if you had, and a very dangerous one too. Now, would you like to put the case into the hands of the police, or would you rather that we kept our own counsel and looked into it ourselves?" "I should like you to decide that," said I. "The reason that I ask," said Thorndyke, "is this. The machinery of the police is adjusted to professional crime, burglary, coining, forgery, and so forth, and their methods are mostly based on information received. The professional crook is generally well known to the police, and, when wanted for any particular job, can be found without much difficulty and the information necessary for his conviction obtained from the usual sources. But in cases of obscure, non-professional crime, the police are at a disadvantage. The criminal is unknown to them. There are no confederates from whom to get information. Consequently, they have no starting point for their inquiries. They can't create clues, and they, very naturally, will not devote time, labour and money to cases in which they have nothing to go on. Now, this affair of yours does not look like a professional crime. No motive is evident, and you can give no information that would help the police. I doubt if they would do much more than give you some rather disagreeable publicity, and they might even suspect you of some kind of imposture." "Gad!" I exclaimed, "that's just what they would do. It's what they did last time, and this affair would write me down in their eyes a confirmed mystery monger." "Last time?" queried Thorndyke. "What last time is that? Have there been any other attempts?" "Not on me," I replied, "but I had an adventure one night about 6 or 7 weeks ago that has made the Hampstead police look on me, I think, with some suspicion." And here I gave my two friends a description of my encounter with the dead, or insensible, cleric in Millfield Lane, and my discoveries on the following morning. "But, my dear Jardine," Thorndyke exclaimed when I had finished, "what an extraordinary man you are! It seems as if you could hardly show your nose out of doors without becoming involved in some dark and dreadful mystery." "Well," said I hope I have now exhausted my gifts in that respect. I am not thirsting for more experiences. But what do you think about that Hampstead affair? Do you think I could possibly have been mistaken? Could the man have been merely insensible, after all, as the police suggested?" Thorndyke shook his head. "I don't think," he replied, "that it is possible to take that view. You see, the man had disappeared. Now, he could not have got away unassisted. In fact, he could not have walked at all. One would have to assume that some persons appeared directly after you left and carried him away, and that they appeared and retired so quickly as not to be overtaken by you on your return a few minutes later with the police. That is assuming too much. And then there are the traces which you discovered on the following day, which seem to suggest strongly that a body had been carried away to Ken Wood. It is 1,000 pities that you encountered that keeper. If you could have followed the tracks while they were fresh, you might have been able to ascertain whither it had been carried. But now, to return to your latest experience, what shall we do? Shall we communicate with the police, or shall we make a few investigations on our own account?" "As far as I am concerned," I replied eagerly, "a private investigation would be greatly preferable. But wouldn't it take up rather a lot of your time?" "Now, Jardine, you needn't apologize," said Jervis. "Unless I'm much mistaken, my respected senior has struck soundings, as the nautical phrase has it. He has a theory of your case, and he would like to see it through. Isn't that so, Thorndyke?" "Well," Thorndyke admitted, "I will confess that the case piques my curiosity somewhat. It is an unusual affair, and suggests some curious hypotheses which might be worth testing. So, if you agree, Jardine, that we make at least a few preliminary investigations, I suggest that, as soon as Batson returns, we three go over to what the newspapers would call the scene of the tragedy and reconstitute the affair on the spot." "And what about Batson?" I asked. "Shall we tell him anything?" "I think we must," said Thorndyke, "if only to put him on his guard, for your unknown enemy may be his enemy too." At this moment the street door banged loudly, a quick step danced along the hall, and Batson himself burst into the room. "Good Lord!" he exclaimed, halting abruptly at the door and gazing in dismay at our little council. "What's the matter? Anything happened?" Thorndyke laughed as he shook the hand of his quondam pupil. "Come, come, Batson," said he, "don't make me out such a bird of ill omen. I was afraid something awkward might have occurred. Police job or inquest or something of that sort." "You weren't so very far wrong," said Thorndyke. "When you are at liberty, I'll tell you about it." "I'm at liberty now," said Batson, dropping into a chair and glaring at Thorndyke through his spectacles. "No scandal, I hope?" Thorndyke reassured him on this point, and gave him a brief account of my adventure and our proposed visit to the works, to which he listened with occasional ejaculations of astonishment and relief. "By gum!" he exclaimed, "what a mercy you got there in time. If you hadn't, there'd have been an inquest and a devil of a fuss. I should never have heard the last of it. Ruined the practice, and worried me into a lunatic asylum. Oh, and about those works, I wouldn't go there if I were you." "Why not?" Thorndyke asked. "Well, you may have to answer some awkward questions, and we don't want this affair to get about, you know. No use raising a dust. Rumpus of any kind plays the deuce with a medical practice." Thorndyke smiled at my principal's frank egoism. "Jervis and I went over last night," said he, "and had a hasty look around, and we found the place quite deserted. Probably it is so still." "Then you won't be able to get in. How'd you get in last night?" "I happened to have a piece of stiff wire in my pocket," Thorndyke replied impassively. "Ha!" said Batson. "Wire, eh? Picklock, in fact. I wouldn't, if I were you. Devil of a bobbery if anyone sees you. Hallo, there goes the bell. Patient. Let him wait. 'Tisn't 6 yet, is it?" "2 minutes past," replied Thorndyke, rising and looking at his watch. "Perhaps we'd better be starting, as it's now dark, and the business at the works, if there is any, is probably over for the day." "Hang the works!" exclaimed Batson. "I wouldn't go nosing about there. What's the good? Jardine's all right, and the chappie isn't likely to be on view. You'll only raise a stink for nothing, and bring in a crowd of beastly reporters humming about the place. There's that damn bell again. Well, if you won't stay, perhaps you'll look me up some other time. Always delighted to see you. Jervis too. You're not going, Jardine? I've got to settle up with you and hear your report." "I'll look in later," said I, "when you've finished the evening's work." "Right you are," said Batson, opening the door and adroitly edging us out. "Sorry you can't stay. Good night. Good night." He shepherded us persuasively and compellingly down the hall, with a skill born of long practice with garrulous patients, and, having exchanged us on the doorstep for a stout woman with 2 children, returned into the house with his prey and was lost to sight. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of A Silent Witness by R.Austin Freeman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 7. An Unseen Enemy. From my late principal's house we walked away quickly down the lamplit street, all, I think, dimly amused at the circumstances of our departure. "Is Batson always like that?" Thorndyke asked. "Always," I replied. "Hurry and bustle are his normal states." "Dear, dear," commented Thorndyke. "What a terrible amount of time he must waste. Of course, one can understand now how that cremation muddle came about. Your incurable hustler is always thinking of the things he has got to do next, instead of the thing that he is doing at the moment. By the way, Jardine, I am taking it for granted that you would like to inspect these premises. It is not essential. Jervis and I had a preliminary look round last night, and I dare say we picked up most of the facts that are likely to be of importance if we should be going farther into the matter." "I think it would be as well for me to take a look at the place and show you exactly where and how the affair happened." "I think so too," said Thorndyke. "It was all pretty evident, but you might be able to show us something that we had overlooked. Here we are. Wonder if Mr. Gill is on the premises, supposing him still to frequent them." He looked up and down the street, and, taking a key from his pocket, inserted it into the lock. "Why, how on earth did you get the key?" I asked. Thorndyke looked at me slyly. "We keep a tame mechanic," said he, as he turned the key and opened the wicket. "Yes, but how did you get the pattern of the lock?" I asked. Thorndyke laughed softly. "It is only a simple trade lock. The fact is, Jardine, that in our branch of practice we have occasionally to take some rather irregular proceedings. For instance, I usually carry a small set of picklocks, fortunately for you. That is how I got in last night. Then I never go abroad without a little box of moulding wax, a most invaluable material, Jardine, for collecting certain kinds of evidence. Well, with a slip of wood and a bit of wax I was able to furnish my man with the necessary data for filing up a blank key. One doesn't want to be seen using a picklock. Now, can you show us the way?" He flashed a pocket electric lamp on the ground, and we advanced over the rough cobbles until we reached a door at the side. "This is where I went in," said I. "It opens into a sort of corridor, and at the end is a door opening on some steps that lead down to the passage below." Thorndyke tried the handle of the door and pushed, but it was evidently locked or bolted. "I left this door unlocked last night," said he, "so it is clear that someone has been here since. I hardly expected that. I thought our friend would have cleared off for good, but it is possible that Gill had nothing to do with the attempt. The premises may have been used by someone who happened to know that they were unoccupied. It would have been quite easy for such a person to gain admittance, as you see." While speaking, he had produced from his pocket a little bunch of skeleton keys, with one of which he now quietly unlocked the door. "These builders' locks," said he, "are merely symbolic of security. You are not expected to unfasten them without authority, but you can if you like, and happen to have a bit of stiff wire." We entered the corridor, and, as we proceeded, looked into the rooms that opened out of it. One of them was meagrely furnished as an office, but the thick layer of dust on the desk and stools showed clearly that it had been long disused. The other rooms were empty and desolate, and showed no trace of use or occupation. "The worthy Gill," said Jervis, "seems to have been able, like Diogenes, to get on with a very modest outfit." "Yes," agreed Thorndyke. "It is a little difficult to guess what his occupation is. The place looks as if it had never been used at all. Shall I go first?" He halted for a moment, passing the light of his lamp over the massive door at the head of the steps, and then began to descend. It was certainly a horrible and repulsive place, especially to my eyes, with the recollection of my late experience fresh in my mind. The rough brick walls, covered with the crumbling remains of old whitewash, the black masses of cobwebs that drooped like funereal stalactites from the ceiling, the fungi that sprouted in corners, and the snail tracks that glistened in the lamplight on the stone floor, all contributed to a vault-like sepulchral effect that was most unpleasantly suggestive of what might have been and very nearly had been. My late prison was easily distinguished by the two holes in the door. We looked in, but that cellar was completely empty save for a few chips of wood and a pinch or two of sawdust, memorials of my sojourn in the lethal chamber, at which I could hardly look without a shudder. Then we passed on to the next cellar, the one adjoining my prison, and this was an object of no little curiosity to me. Here, while I was securely bolted into my cell, that unknown villain had, deliberately and in cold blood, made all the arrangements for my murder, arrangements which he little suspected that I should survive to look upon. Thorndyke, too, was interested. He stood at the open door, looking in as if considering the positions of various objects, as in fact he was. "Someone has been here since last night, Jervis," said he. "Yes," agreed Jervis. "That gas bottle has been taken down from the opening. You see, Jardine," he continued, "he had stood that big packing case up on end and laid the gas bottle along the top, with its nozzle just opposite the hole. Two other bottles were standing upright with their nozzles upwards." "I understand," said Thorndyke, "that you heard 3 bottles only turned on." "Yes," I answered. "There was the one opposite the hole and 2 others." "I ask," Thorndyke said, "because there are, as you see, 7 other bottles lying by the wall. Those are all empty. We tried them when we came here last night." "I know nothing about those others," said I. "The 3 bottles that I have mentioned I heard distinctly, and after he had turned on the third, the man went out of the cellar and closed up the door." "Then," said Thorndyke, "the other 7 were presumably used for some other and, let us hope, more legitimate purpose. I wonder why our friend has been at the trouble of moving the cylinders." "Perhaps," suggested Jervis, "he thought that the arrangement might be a little too illuminating for the police if they should happen to pay a visit to the place. He may not be aware that the apparatus had already been inspected in situ by us. Or again, the cylinders may have been moved by someone else. We are assuming that he is a lawful occupant of the premises, but he may be a mere secret intruder like ourselves, who has discovered that the place is more or less unoccupied, and has made use of the premises and plant for his own benevolent purposes." "Yes," agreed Thorndyke, "that is perfectly true. But we can put the matter to the test, at least negatively. If the cylinders have been moved by an innocent stranger, they will bear the prints of hands." "But why shouldn't the man himself leave the prints of his hands on the cylinders?" I asked. "Because, my dear Jardine, he is too knowing a bird. Jervis and I went carefully over the cylinders last night in the hope of getting a few fingerprints to submit to Scotland Yard, but not a vestige could we find. Our friend has seen to that. We assumed that he had operated in gloves, and your description of him confirmed our assumption. Which, in its way, is an interesting fact, for a man who is knowing enough to take these precautions has probably had some previous experience of crime, or at least has some acquaintance with the ways of criminals. The suggestion, in fact, is that, although this is not an ordinary professional crime, the perpetrator may be a professional criminal. And the further suggestion is, of course, that of very deliberate premeditation." While he had been speaking he had produced from his pocket a small flattened bottle fitted with a metal cap and filled with a yellowish powder. Removing the cap and uncovering a perforated inner cap, like that of an iodoform dredger, he proceeded to shake a cloud of the light powder over the 3 upper cylinders, jarring them with his foot to make the powder spread. Then he blew sharply on them, one after the other, when the powder disappeared from their surfaces, leaving visible 1 or 2 shapeless whitened smears, but never a trace of a fingerprint or even the shape of a hand. Thorndyke rose and slipped the bottle back in his pocket. "Apparently," said he, "the cylinders were moved by our unknown friend with the same careful precautions as on the first occasion. A wary gentleman this, Jervis. He'll give us a run for our money at any rate." "Yes," agreed Jervis. "He doesn't mean to give himself away. He preserves his incognito most punctiliously, I'll say that for him." "And meanwhile," said Thorndyke, "we had better proceed with our measures for drawing him out of this modest retirement. I want you, Jardine, to look round this cellar and tell us if any of the things that you see in it reminds you of anything that has happened to you, or suggests any thought or reflection." I looked round, I'm afraid rather vacantly. A more unsuggestive collection of objects I have never looked upon. "There are the gas cylinders," I said feebly, "but I've told you about them. I don't see anything else, except a few oddments of rubbish." "Then take a good look at the rubbish," said he. "Remember that it may be necessary at some future time for you to recall exactly what this cellar was like and what it contained. You may even have to make a sworn statement. So cast your eye round and tell us what you see." I did so, wondering inwardly what the deuce I was expected to see, and what might be the importance of my seeing it. "I see," said I, "a mouldy-looking cellar about 15 feet by 12, with very bad brick walls, a plaster ceiling in an advanced stage of decay, and a concrete floor. In the left-hand wall is a hole about 6 inches square opening into the adjoining cellar. The contents are 10 gas cylinders, all apparently empty, a key or spanner which seems to have been used to turn the cocks, a large packing case, which, to judge by its shape, seems to have contained gas cylinders." "The word 'large,'" interrupted Thorndyke, "is not a particularly exact one." "Well, then, a packing case about 7 feet long by 2½ feet wide and deep." "That's better," said Thorndyke. "Always give your dimensions in quantitative terms if possible. Go on." "There are a couple of waterproof sheets," said I. "I don't see quite what they can have been used for." "Never mind their use," said Thorndyke. "Note the fact that they are here." "I have," said I, "and that seems to complete the list, with the exception of the straw in which I suppose the gas cylinders were packed. There's a large quantity of that, but not more than would seem necessary for the purpose. And that seems to complete the inventory, and I may say that none of these things conveys any suggestion whatever to my mind." "Probably not," said Thorndyke, "and it is quite possible that none of these things has any particular significance at all, but as they are the only facts offered us, we must make the best of them. There is one other cellar that we have not yet looked into, I think." We came out, and, walking along the passage, came to another door which stood slightly ajar. Thorndyke opened it, and, throwing in the light of his lamp, revealed a considerable stack of long iron gas bottles and one or two packing cases similar to the one I had already seen. "I presume," said he, "that these are full cylinders, the store from which our friend got his supply. But we may as well make sure." He ran back into the adjoining cellar, and returned with the spanner, with which he proceeded to turn the cock of one of the topmost cylinders, upon which a loud hiss and a thin snowy cloud showed that his surmise was correct. He had just closed the cock and stepped out into the passage to take back the spanner, when I saw him stop suddenly as if listening. And then he sniffed once or twice. "What is it?" asked Jervis. But Thorndyke, without replying, ran quickly along the passage and up the steps, and I heard him trying the door at the top. "Bring up one of the empty cylinders," he said quietly. "They have bolted us in and apparently set fire to the place." We did not require much urging to act quickly. Picking up one of the long, ponderous iron cylinders, we ran with it along the passage towards the light of Thorndyke's lamp. As we ascended the steps, I became plainly aware of the smell of burning wood and of a crackling sound, faintly audible through the massive door. "There is only one bolt," said Thorndyke. "I noticed it as we came in. I will throw my light on the part of the door where it is fixed, and you two must batter on that spot with the cylinder." The door was, as I have said, a massive one, but it would have been a massive door indeed that could have withstood the blows of that ponderous iron cylinder wielded by two strong men whose lives depended on their efforts. At the very first crash of the battering ram, a tiny chink opened, and at each thundering blow the building shook. Furiously we pounded at the thick, plank-built door, and slowly the chink widened as the screws of the bolt tore out of the woodwork. And as the chink opened, a thin reek of pungent smoke filtered in, and the cold light of Thorndyke's lantern became contrasted with a red glare from without. And then, suddenly, the door, under the heavy battering, burst from its fastenings and swung open. A blinding, choking cloud of smoke and sparks rolled in upon us, through which we could see in the corridor outside a pile of straw and crates and broken packing cases, blazing and cracking furiously. It looked as if we were cut off beyond all hope. Jervis and I had dropped the now useless cylinder and were gazing in horror at the blazing mass that filled the corridor and cut off our only means of escape, when we were recalled by the voice of Thorndyke, speaking in his usual quiet and precise manner. "We must get the full cylinders up as quickly as possible," said he. And, running down the steps, he made straight for the end cellar, whither we followed him. Picking up one of the cylinders, we carried it quickly to the top of the steps. "Lay it down," said Thorndyke, "and fetch another." Jervis and I ran back to the cellar, and taking up another cylinder, brought it along the passage. As we were ascending the steps, there suddenly arose a loud penetrating hiss, and as we reached the top, we saw Thorndyke disengaging the spanner from the cock of the cylinder, out of which a jet of liquid was issuing, mingled with a dense, snowy cloud. An instantaneous glance, as we laid down the fresh cylinder, reassured me very considerably. The icy, volatile liquid and the falling cloud of intensely cold carbonic acid snow had produced an immediate effect, as was evident in a black and smouldering patch in the midst of the blazing mass. With reviving hope I followed Jervis once more down the steps and along the passage to the end cellar, from which we brought forth a third cylinder. By this time the passage was so filled with smoke that it was difficult either to see or to breathe, and the bright light that had first poured in through the open doorway had already pulled down so far that Thorndyke's figure, framed in the opening, loomed dim and shadowy amidst the smoke and against the dusky red background. We found him, when we reached the top of the steps, holding the great gas bottle and directing the stream of snow and liquid onto those parts of the wood and straw from which flames still issued. "It will be all right," he said in his calm, unemotional way. "The fire had not really got an effective start. The straw made a great show, but that is nearly all burnt now, and all this carbonic acid gas will soon smother the burning wood. But we must be careful that it doesn't smother us too. The steps will be the safest place for the present." He opened the cock of the new cylinder, and, having placed it so that it played on the most refractory part of the burning mass, backed to the steps where Jervis and I stood looking through the doorway. The fire was, as he had said, rapidly dying down. The volumes of gas produced by the evaporation of the liquid and the melting snow cut off the supply of air, so that, in place of the flames that had at first looked so alarming, only a dense reek of smoke arose. "Now," said Thorndyke, after we had waited on the steps a couple of minutes more, "I think we might make a sortie and put an end to it. If you can get the smouldering stuff off that wooden floor down on to the stone, the danger will be over." He led the way cautiously into the corridor, and, once more bringing his electric lamp into requisition, he began to kick the smouldering cases and crates and the blackened masses of straw down the steps on to the stone floor of the passage, whither we followed them and scattered them with our feet until they were completely safe from any chance of re-ignition. "There," said Jervis, giving a final kick at a small heap of smoking straw. "I should think that ought to do. There's no fear of that stuff lighting up again. And if I may venture to make the remark, the sooner we're off these premises the happier I shall be. Our friend's methods of entertaining his visitors are a trifle too strenuous for my taste. He might try dynamite next." "Yes," I agreed, "or he might take pot shots at us with a revolver from some dark corner." "It is much more likely," said Thorndyke, "that he has cleared off in anticipation of the alarm of fire. Still, it is undeniable that we shall be safer outside. Shall I go first and show you a light?" He piloted us along the corridor and up the cobbled yard, putting away his lamp as he unlocked the wicket. There was no sign of anyone about the premises, nor, when we had passed out of the gate, was there anyone in sight in the street. I looked about, expecting to see some sign of the fire, but there was no smoke visible, and only a slight smell of burning wood. The smoke must have drifted out at the back. "Well," Thorndyke remarked, "it has been quite an exciting little episode, and a highly satisfactory finish, as things turned out, though it might easily have been very much the reverse. But for the fortunate chance of those gas bottles being available, I don't think we should be alive at this moment." "No," agreed Jervis, "we should be in much the same condition by this time as Batson's late patient, Mr. Maddock, or at least well on our way to that disembodied state. However, all's well that ends well. Are you coming our way, Jardine?" "I will walk a little way with you," said I. "Then I must go back to Batson to saddle up and fetch my traps." I walked with them to Oxford Street, and we discussed our late adventure as we went. "It was a pretty strong hint to clear out, wasn't it?" Jervis remarked. "Yes," replied Thorndyke. "It didn't leave us much option. But the affair can't be left at this. I shall have a watch set on those premises. I shall make some more particular enquiries about Mr. Gill. By the way, Jardine, I haven't your address. I'd better have it in case I want to communicate with you, and you'd better have my card in case anything turns up which you think I ought to know." We accordingly exchanged cards, and as we had now reached the corner of Oxford Street, I wished my friends adieu and thoughtfully retraced my steps to Jacob Street. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of A Silent Witness by R.Austin Freeman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. It's an ill wind. London is a wonderful place. From the urban greyness of Jacob Street to the borders of Hampstead Heath was, even in those days of the slow horse tram, but a matter of minutes. A good many minutes perhaps, but still considerably under an hour. Yet in that brief and leisurely journey one exchanged the grim sordidness of a most unlovely street for the solitude and sweet rusticity of open and charming country. A day or two after my second adventure in the mineral water works, I was leaning on the parapet of the viaduct, the handsome red brick viaduct with which some builder, unknown to me, had spanned the pond beyond the upper heath, apparently with purely decorative motive, and in a spirit of sheer philanthropy. For no road seemed to lead anywhere in particular over it, and there was no reason why any wayfarer should wish to cross the pond rather than walk round it. Indeed, in those days it was covered by a turfy expanse seldom trodden by any feet but those of the sheep that grazed in the meadows bordering the pond. I leaned on the parapet, smoking my pipe with deep contentment and looking down into the placid water. Flags and rushes grew at its borders, water lilies spread their flat leaves on its surface, and a small party of urchins angled from the margin, with the keen joy of the juvenile sportsman who suspects that his proceedings are unlawful. I had lounged on the parapet for several minutes when I became aware of a man approaching along the indistinct track that crossed the viaduct, and, as he drew near, I recognized him as the keeper whom I had met in Ken Wood on the morning after my discovery of the body in Millfield Lane. I would have let him pass with a smile of recognition, but he had no intention of passing. Touching his hat politely, he halted, and, having wished me good morning, remarked, "You didn't tell me, sir, what it was you were looking for that morning when I met you in the wood." "No," I replied, "but apparently someone else has." "Well, sir, you see," he said, "the sergeant came up the next day with a plainclothes man to have a look round, and, as the sergeant is an old acquaintance of mine, he gave me the tip as to what they were after. I'm sorry, sir, you didn't tell me what you were looking for." "Why?" I asked. "Well," he replied, "we might have found something if we had looked while the tracks were fresh. Unfortunately, there was a gale in the night that fetched down a lot of leaves and blew up those that had already fallen, so that any footmarks would have got hidden before the sergeant came." "What did the police officers seem to think about it?" I asked. "Why, to speak the truth," the keeper replied, "they seemed to think it was all bogey." "Do you mean to say," I asked, "that they thought I had invented the whole story?" "Oh, no, sir," he replied, "not that. They believed you had seen a man lying in the lane, but they didn't believe that he was a dead man, and they thought your imagination had misled you about the tracks." "Then I suppose they didn't find anything?" said I. "No, they didn't, and I haven't been able to find anything myself, though I've had a good look round." And then, after a brief pause, "I wonder," he said, "if you would care to come up to the wood and have a look at the place yourself?" I considered for a moment. I had nothing to do, for I was taking a day off, and the man's proposal sounded rather attractive. Finally, I accepted his offer, and we turned back together towards the wood. Hampstead, the Hampstead of those days, was singularly rustic and remote. But within the wood it was incredible that the town of London actually lay within the sound of a church bell or the flight of a bullet. Along the shady paths, carpeted with moss and silvery lichen, overshadowed by the boughs of noble beeches, or in leafy hollows with the humus of centuries under our feet, and the whispering silence of the woodland all around, we might have been treading the glades of some primeval forest. Nor was the effect of this strange remoteness less when presently, emerging from the thicker portion of the wood, we came upon a moss-grown, half-ruinous boat-house on the sedgy margin of a lake, in which was drawn up a rustic-looking and evidently little-used punt. "It's wonderful quiet about here, sir," the keeper remarked, as a water-hen stole out from behind a clump of high rushes and scrambled over the leaves of the water-lilies. "And presumably," I remarked, "it's quieter still at night." "You're right, sir," the keeper replied. "If that man had got as far as this, he'd have had mighty little trouble in putting the body where no one was ever likely to look for it." "I suppose," said I, "that you had a good look at the edges of the lake?" "Yes," he answered. "I went right round it, and so did the police, for that matter, and we had a good look at the punt too. But, all the same, it wouldn't surprise me if one fine day that body came floating up among the lilies. Always supposing, that is," he added, "that there really was a body." "How far is it," I asked, "from the lake to the place where you met me that morning?" "It's only a matter of 2 or 3 minutes," he answered. "We may as well walk that way, and you can see for yourself." Accordingly we set forth together, and coming presently upon one of the moss-grown paths, followed it past a large summer-house until we came in sight of the beach beyond which I had encountered him while I was searching for the tracks. As we went he plied me with questions as to what I had seen on the night in the lane, and I made no scruple of telling him all that I had told the police, seeing that they, on their side, had made no secret of the matter. Of course, it was idle, after this long period, for it was now more than 7 weeks since I had seen the body, to attempt anything in the nature of research. It certainly did look as if the man who had stolen into that wood that night had been bound for the solitary lake. The punt, I had noticed, was only secured with a rope, so that the murderer, for such I assumed he must have been, could easily have carried his dreadful burden out into the middle and there sunk it with weights, and so hidden it for ever. It was a quick, simple and easy method of hiding the traces of his crime, and, if the police had not thought it worth while to search the water with drags, there was no reason why the buried secret should not remain buried for all time. After we had walked for some time about the pleasant, shady wood, less shady now that the yellowing leaves were beginning to fall with the passing of autumn, the keeper conducted me to the exit by which I had left on the previous occasion. As I was passing out of the wicket, my eye fell once more on the cottage which I had then noticed, and, recalling the remark that my fair acquaintance had let fall concerning the artist to whom the derelict knife was supposed to belong, I said: "You mentioned, I think, that that house was let to an artist." "It was," he replied, "but it's empty now. The artist has gone away." "It must be a pleasant little house to live in," I said, "at any rate in summer." "Yes," he replied, "a country house within an hour's walk of the Bank of England. Would you like to have a look at it, sir? I've got the keys." Now, I certainly had no intention of offering myself as a tenant, but, yet, to an idle man, there is a certain attractiveness in an empty house of an eligible kind, a certain interest in roaming through the rooms and letting one's fancy furnish them with one's own household goods. I accepted the man's invitation, and, opening the wide gate that admitted to the garden from a by road, we walked up to the door of the house. "It's quite a nice little place," the keeper remarked. "There isn't much garden, you see, but then you've got the heath all round, and there's a small stable and coach house if you should be wanting to go into town." "Did the last tenant keep any kind of carriage?" I asked. "I don't think so," said the keeper, "but I fancy he used to hire a little cart sometimes when he had things to bring in from town, but I don't know very much about him or his habits." We walked through the empty rooms together, looking out of the windows and commenting on the pleasant prospects that all of them commanded, and talking about the man who had last lived in the house. "He was a queer sort of fellow," said the keeper. "He and his wife seem to have lived here all alone without any servant, and they seem often to have left the house to itself for a day or two at a time. But he could paint. I have stopped and had a look when he has been at work, and it was wonderful to see how he knocked off those pictures. He didn't seem to use brushes, but he had a lot of knives, like little trowels, and he used to shovel the paint on with them, and he always wore gloves when he was painting. Didn't like to get the paint on his hands, I suppose." "It sounds as if it would be very awkward," I said. "Just what I should have thought," the keeper agreed, "but he didn't seem to find it so. This seems to be the place that he worked in." Apparently the keeper was right. The room which we had now entered was evidently the late studio, and did not appear to have been cleaned up since the tenant left. The floor was littered with scraps of paper on which a palette knife had been cleaned, with empty paint tubes and one or two broken and worn out brushes, and, in a packing case which seemed to have served as a receptacle for rubbish, were one or two canvases that had been torn from their stretchers and thrown away. I picked them out and glanced at them with some interest, remembering what my fair friend had said. For the most part they were mere experiments or failures, deliberately defaced with strokes or daubs of paint, but one of them was a quite spirited and attractive sketch, rough and unfinished, but skilfully executed and undefaced. I stretched out the crumpled canvas and looked at it with considerable interest, for it represented Millfield Lane, and showed the large elms and the posts and the high fence under which I had sheltered in the rain. In fact, it appeared to have been taken from the exact spot on which the body had been lying, and from which I had made my own drawing. Not that there was anything in the latter coincidence, for it was the only sketchable spot in the lane. "It's really quite a nice sketch," I said. "It seems a pity to leave it here among the rubbish." "It does, sir," the keeper agreed. "If you like it, you'd better roll it up and put it in your pocket. You won't be robbing anyone." As it seemed that I was but rescuing it from a rubbish heap, I ventured to follow the keeper's advice, and, rolling the canvas up, carefully stowed it in my pocket. And shortly after, as I had now seen all that there was to see, which was mighty little, we left the house, and, at the gate, the keeper took leave of me with a touch of his hat. I made my way slowly back towards my lodgings by way of the Spaniards Road and Hampstead Lane, turning over in my mind as I went the speculations suggested by my visit to the wood. Of the existence of the lake I had not been previously aware. Now that I had seen it, I felt very little doubt that it was known to the mysterious murderer, for such I felt convinced he was, who must have been lurking in the lane that night when I was sheltering under the lee of the fence. The route that he had then taken appeared to be the direct route to the lake. That he was carrying the body I had no doubt whatever, and seeing that he had carried it so far, it appeared probable that he had some definite hiding place in view. And what hiding place could be so suitable as this remote piece of still water? No digging, no troublesome and dangerous preparation would be necessary. There was the punt in readiness to bear him to the deep water in the middle. A silent, easily handled conveyance. A few stones or some heavy object from the boat house would be all that was needful, and in a moment he would be rid for ever of the dreadful witness of his crime. Thus reflecting, not without dissatisfaction at the passive part that I had played in this sinister affair, I passed through the turnstile or kissing gate at the entrance to Millfield Lane. Almost certainly the murderer or the victim, or both, had passed through that very gate on the night of the tragedy. The thought came to me with added solemnity with the recollection of the silent wood and the dark, still water fresh in my mind, and caused me unconsciously to tread more softly and walk more sedately than usual. The lane was little frequented at any time, and now, at midday, was almost as deserted as at midnight. Very remote it seemed too, and very quiet, with a silence that recalled the hush of the wood, and yet the silence was not quite unbroken. From somewhere ahead, from one of the many windings of the tortuous lane, came the sound of hurried footsteps. I stopped to listen. There were two persons, one treading lightly, the other more heavily, apparently a man and a woman, and both were running fast. There was nothing remarkable in this, perhaps, but yet the sound smote on my ear with a certain note of alarm that made me quicken my pace and listen yet more intently. And suddenly there came another sound, a muffled, whimpering cry like that of a frightened woman. Instantly I gave an answering shout and sprang forward at a swift run. I had turned one of the numerous corners and was racing down a straight stretch of the lane when a woman darted round the corner ahead and ran towards me, holding out her hands. I recognized her at a glance, though now she was dishevelled, pale, wild-eyed, breathless, and nearly frantic with terror, and rage against her assailant spurred me on to greater speed. But when I would have passed her to give chase to the wretch, she clutched my arm frantically with both hands and detained me. "Let me go and catch the scoundrel!" I exclaimed, but she only clung the tighter. "No," she panted, "don't leave me! I'm terrified! Don't go away!" I ground my teeth. Even as we stood, I could hear the ruffian's footsteps receding as rapidly as they had advanced. In a few moments he would be beyond pursuit. "Do let me go and stop that villain!" I implored. "You're quite safe now, and you can follow me and keep me in sight." But she shook her head passionately, and still clutching my sleeve with one hand, pressed the other to her heart. "No, no, no!" she gasped, with a catch in her voice that was almost a sob. "I can't be alone. I'm frightened. Oh, please don't go away from me." What could I do? The poor girl was evidently beside herself with terror and exhausted by her frantic flight. It would have been cruel to leave her in that state. But all the same it was infuriating. I had no idea what the man had done to terrify her in this way. But that was of no consequence. The natural impulse of a healthy young man when he learns that a woman has been ill-used is to hammer the offender effectively in the first place, and then to inquire into the affair. That was what I wanted to do, but it was not to be. "Well," I said, by way of compromise, "let us walk back together. Perhaps we may be able to find out which way the man went." To this she agreed. I drew her arm through mine, for she was still trembling and looked faint and weak, and we began to retrace her steps towards Highgate. Of course the man was nowhere to be seen, and by the time that we had returned to the sharp corner where I had found the body of the priest, the man was not only out of sight, but his footsteps were no longer audible. Still, we went on for some distance in the hopes of meeting someone who could tell us which way the miscreant had gone, but we met nobody. Only, some distance past the posts, we came in sight of a sketching box and a camp stool, lying by the side of the path. "Surely those are your things?" I said. "Yes," she answered. "I had forgotten all about them. I dropped them when I began to run." I picked up the box and the stool, and debated with myself whether it was worth while to go on any farther. From where we stood, nothing was to be seen, for the lane was still enclosed on both sides by a 7-foot fence of oak boards. But the chance of overtaking the fugitive was not to be considered. By this time he was probably out of the lane, on the heath or in the surrounding meadows. And meanwhile my companion, though calmer and less breathless, looked very pale and shaken. "I don't know that it's any use," I said, "to tire you by going any farther. The man is evidently gone." She seemed relieved at my decision, and it then occurred to me to suggest that she should sit down a while on the bank under the high fence to recover herself, and to this, too, she assented gladly. "If it wouldn't distress you," I said, "would you mind telling me what had happened?" She pondered for a few seconds, and then answered: "It doesn't sound much in the telling, and I expect you'll think me very silly to be so much upset." "I'm sure I shan't," I said, with perfect confidence in the correctness of my statement. "Well," she said, "what happened was this, as nearly as I can remember. I was coming up the path from the ponds, and I had to pass a man who was leaning against the fence by the stile. As I came near to him, he looked at me at first in quite an ordinary way, and then he suddenly began to stare in a most singular and disturbing fashion. Not at me so much as at this little crucifix which I wear hung from my neck. As I passed through the turnstile, he spoke to me. 'Would you mind letting me look at that crucifix?' he asked. It was a most astonishing piece of impertinence, and I was so taken aback that I hardly had the presence of mind to refuse. However, I did, and very decidedly too. Then he came up to me and, in a most threatening and alarming manner, said, 'You found that crucifix. You picked it up somewhere near here. It's mine, and I'll ask you to let me have it, if you please.' Now, this was perfectly untrue. The crucifix was given to me by my father when I was quite a little child, and I've worn it ever since I have been grown up. Ever since he died, in fact, 6 years ago. I told the man this, but he made no pretence of believing me, and was evidently about to renew his demand when 2 labourers appeared, coming down the lane. I thought this a good opportunity to escape, and walked away quickly up the lane. It was very silly of me. I ought to have gone the other way." "Of course you ought," I agreed. "You ought to have got out into a public road at once." "Yes, I see that now," she said. "It was very foolish of me. However, I walked on pretty quickly, for there was something in the man's face that had frightened me, and I was anxious to get home. I looked back from time to time, and, when I saw no sign of the man, I began to recover myself. But just as I had got to the most solitary part of the lane, just about where we are now, shut in by these high fences, I heard quick footsteps behind me. I looked back and saw the man coming after me. Then I suppose I got in a sudden panic, for I dropped my sketching things and began to run. But as soon as I began to run, the man broke into a run too. I raced for my life, and when I heard the man gaining on me, I suppose I must have called out. Then I heard your shout from the upper part of the lane and ran on faster than ever to gain your protection. That's all, and I suppose you think that I've been making a great fuss about nothing." "I don't think anything of the kind," I said, "and neither would our absent friend if I could get hold of him. By the way, what sort of person was he? A tramp?" "Oh no, quite a respectable looking person. In fact, he would have passed for a gentleman." "Can you give any sort of description of him? Not that verbal descriptions are of much use, except in the case of a hunchback or a Chinaman or some other easily identifiable creature." "No, they're not," she agreed, "and I don't think that I can tell you much about this man, excepting that he was clean shaved, of medium height, quite well dressed, and wore a round head and slate-coloured suede gloves. "I'm afraid we shan't get hold of him from that description," I said. "The only thing that you can do is to avoid solitary places for the present, and not to come through this lane again alone." "Yes," she said, "I suppose I must. But it's very unfortunate. One cannot always take a companion when one goes sketching, even if it were desirable, which it is not." As to the desirability, in the case of a good-looking girl, of wandering about alone in solitary places, I had my own opinions, and very definite opinions they were, but I kept them to myself. And so we sat silent for a while. She was still pale and agitated, and perhaps her recital of her misadventure had not been wholly beneficial. At the moment that this idea occurred to me, a crackling in my breast pocket reminded me of the forgotten canvas, and I bethought me that perhaps a change of subject might divert her mind from her very disagreeable experience. Accordingly, I drew the canvas out of my pocket, and, unrolling it, asked her what she thought of the sketch. In a moment she became quite animated. "Why," she exclaimed, "this looks exactly like the work of that artist who was working on the Heath a little while ago." "It is his," I replied, considerably impressed and rather astonished at her instantaneous recognition. "But I didn't know you were so familiar with his work." "I'm not very familiar with it," she replied, "but, as I told you, I sometimes managed to steal a glance or two when I passed him. You see, his technique is so peculiar that it's easily recognized, and it interested me very much. I should have liked to stop and watch him and get a lesson." "It is rather peculiar work," I said, looking at the canvas with new interest. "Very solid and yet very smooth." "Yes, it is typical knife work, almost untouched with the brush. That was what interested me. The knife is a dangerous tool for a comparative tyro like myself, but yet one would like to learn how to use it. Did he give you this sketch?" I smiled guiltily. "The truth is," I admitted, "I stole it." "How dreadful of you!" she said. "I suppose that you could not be bribed to steal another?" "I would steal it for nothing if you asked me," I answered, "and meanwhile you had better take possession of this one. It will be of more use to you than to me." She shook her head. "No, I won't do that," she said, "though it is most kind of you. You paint, I think, don't you?" "I am only the merest amateur," I replied. "I annexed the sketch for the sake of the subject. I have rather an affection for this lane." "So had I," said she, "until today. Now I hate it. But might I ask how you managed your theft?" I told her about the empty cottage and the rejected canvases in the rubbish box. "I'm afraid none of the others would be of any use to you, because he had drawn a brushful of paint across each of them." "Oh, that wouldn't matter," she said. "The brush strokes would be on dry paint and could easily be scraped off. Besides, it is not the subject but the technique that interests me." "Then I will get into the cottage somehow and purloin the remaining canvases for you." "Oh, but I mustn't give you all this trouble," she protested. "It won't be any trouble," I said. "I shall quite enjoy a deliberate and determined robbery. But where shall I send the spoil?" She produced her card case, and, selecting a card, handed it to me, with a smile. "It seems to me," she said, "that I am inciting you to robbery and acting as a receiver of stolen goods. But I suppose there is no harm in it, though I feel that I ought not to give you all this trouble." I made the usual polite rejoinder as I took from her the little magical slip of pasteboard that, in a moment, transformed her from a stranger to an acquaintance, and gave her a local habitation and a name. Before bestowing it in my pocket book, I glanced at the neat copperplate and read the inscription: "Miss Sylvia Vyne, The Hawthorns, North End." The effect of our conversation had answered my expectations. Her agitation had passed off, the colour had come back to her cheeks, and, in fact, she seemed quite recovered. Apparently she thought so herself, for she rose, saying that she now felt well enough to walk home, and held out her hand for the colour box and stool. "I think," said I, "that if you won't consider me intrusive, I should like to see you safely out onto an inhabited road at least." "I shall accept your escort gratefully," she replied, "as far as the end of the lane, or farther if it's not taking you too much out of your way." Needless to say, I would gladly have escorted so agreeable and winsome a protégée from John o' Groats to Land's End, and found it not out of my way at all; and when she passed out of the gate into Hampstead Lane, I clung tenaciously to the box and stool, and turned towards the Spaniards as though no such thing as dismissal had ever been contemplated. In fact, with the reasonable excuse of carrying the impedimenta, I maintained my place by her side in the absence of a definite congé. And so we walked together, talking quite easily, principally about pictures and painting, until, in the pleasant little hamlet, she halted by a garden gate and, taking her possessions from me, held out a friendly hand. "Good bye," she said. "I can't thank you enough for all your help and kindness. I hope I have not been very troublesome to you." I assured her that she had been most amenable, and, when I had once more cautioned her to avoid solitary places, we exchanged a cordial handshake and parted, she to enter the pleasant, rustic-looking house, and I to betake myself back to my lodgings, lightening the way with much agreeable and self-congratulatory reflection. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of A Silent Witness by R.Austin Freeman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 9. Thorndyke takes up the scent. At my lodgings, which I reached at an unconscionably late hour for lunch, I found a little surprise awaiting me. A short note from Dr. Thorndyke asking me if I should be at liberty early on the following afternoon to show him the spot on which I had found the mysterious body. Of course I answered by return, begging him to come straight on from the hospital to an early lunch, over which we could discuss the facts of the case before setting out. Having dispatched my letter, I called at the offices of the house agent who had the letting of the cottage on the Heath to see if he had duplicate keys. Fortunately he had, and was willing to entrust them to me on the understanding that they should be returned sometime during the next day. I did not, however, go on to the cottage, for it occurred to me that Thorndyke would probably wish to visit the wood, and I could make my visit and purloin the canvases then. A telegram on the following morning informed me that Thorndyke would be with me at 12 o'clock, and, punctually to the minute, he arrived. "I hope you don't mind me swooping down on you in this fashion," he said, as the servant showed him into the room. I assured him very truthfully that I was delighted to be honoured by a visit from him, and he then proceeded to explain. "You may wonder, Jardine, why I am busying myself about this case, which is really no business of mine, or at least appears to be none. But the fact is that as a teacher and a practitioner of medical jurisprudence, I find it advisable to look into any unusual cases. Of course, there is always a considerable probability that I may be consulted concerning any out-of-the-way case, but apart from that, I have the ordinary specialist's interest in anything remarkable in my own speciality." "I should think," said I, "that it would be well for me to give you all the facts before we start." "Exactly, Jardine," he replied. "That is what I want. Tell me all you know about the affair, and then we shall be able to test our conclusions on the spot." He produced a large-scale ordnance map, and, folding it under my direction so that it showed only the region in which we were interested, he stood it up on the table against the water bottle, where we could both see it, and marked on it with a pencil each spot as I described it. It is not necessary for me to record our conversation. I told him the whole story as I have already told it to the reader, pointing out on the map the exact locality where each event occurred. "It's a most remarkable case, Jardine," was his thoughtful comment when I had finished. "Most remarkable. Curiously puzzling and inconsistent, too. For you see that on the one hand it looks like a casual or accidental crime, and yet on the other strongly suggests premeditation. No man, one would think, could have planned to commit a murder in what is, after all, a public thoroughfare, and yet the long distance which the body seems to have been carried and the apparently selected hiding place seem to suggest the previously considered plan." "You think that there is no doubt that the man was really dead?" I asked. "Had you any doubt at the time yourself?" "None at all," I replied. "It was only the disappearance of the body and, perhaps, the sergeant's suggestion that made me think it possible that I might have been mistaken." Thorndyke shook his head. "No, Jardine," said he. "The man was dead. We are safe in assuming that. And on that assumption our investigations must be based. The next question is, how was the body taken away? Did you measure the fence?" "No, but I should say it is about 7 feet high." "And what kind of fence is it? Are there any footholds?" "I can show you exactly what the fence is like," I answered. "That sketch which I have pinned up on the wall was apparently painted from the exact spot on which the body lay. That fence on the right hand side is the one under which I sheltered, and is exactly like the one over which the body seems to have been lifted." Thorndyke rose and walked over to the sketch, which I had fixed to the wall with drawing pins. "Not a bad sketch this, Jardine," he remarked. "Very smartly put in, apparently mostly with the knife. Where did you get it?" I had to confess that the canvas was unlawfully come by, and told him how I had obtained it. "You don't know the artist's name?" said Thorndyke, looking closely at the sketch. "No. In fact, I know nothing about him, excepting that he worked mostly with a small painting knife and usually wore kid gloves." "You don't mean that he worked in gloves?" said Thorndyke. "So I am told," said I. "I never saw him." "It's very odd," said Thorndyke. "I've heard of men wearing a glove on the palette hand to keep off the midges, and many men paint in gloves in exceptionally cold weather. But this sketch seems to have been painted in summer." "I suppose," said I, "the midges don't confine their attentions to the palette hand, and after all, to a man who worked entirely with the knife, a glove wouldn't be really in the way." "No," Thorndyke agreed, "that is true." He looked closely at the sketch, and even took out his pocket lens to help his vision, which seemed almost unnecessary. It appeared that he was as much interested in the unknown artist's peculiar technique as was my friend, Miss Sylvia Vyne. "By the way," said he, when he had resumed his seat at the table, "you were telling me about some kind of gold trinket that you had picked up at the foot of the fence. Shall we have a look at it?" I fetched the little gold object from the dispatch box in which I had locked it up, and handed it to him. He turned it over in his fingers, read the letters that were engraved on it, and examined the little piece of silk cord that was attached to one ring. "There is no doubt," said he, "as to the nature of this object, nor of its connection with the dead man. This is evidently a reliquary, and these initials engraved upon it bear out exactly your description of the body. S.V.D.P. evidently means St. Vincent de Paul, who, as you probably know, was a saint who was distinguished for his works of charity. You have mentioned that the dead man wore a Roman collar, with a narrow dark stripe up the front. That means that he was the lay brother of some religious order, probably some philanthropic order, to whom St. Vincent de Paul would be an object of special devotion. The other letters, A.M.D.G., are the initials of the words Ad Majorem Dei Gloriam, the motto of the Society of Jesus. But as St. Vincent de Paul was not a Jesuit saint, the motto probably refers to the owner of the reliquary, who may have been a Jesuit or a friend of the Society. It was apparently attached, perhaps to the neck, by this silk cord, which seems to have been frayed nearly through, and probably broke when the body was drawn over the top of the fence." "I suppose I ought to have shown it to the police," I said. "I suppose you ought," he replied, "but as you haven't, I think we'd better say nothing about it now." He handed it back to me, and I dropped it into my pocket, intending to return it presently to the dispatch box. A few minutes later we sallied forth on our journey of exploration. It is not necessary to describe this journey in detail, since I have already taken the reader over the ground more than once. We went, of course, to the place where I had found the body, and walked right through to Hampstead Lane. Then we returned and reconstituted the circumstances of that eventful night, after which I conducted Thorndyke to the place where I assumed that the body had been lifted over the fence. "I suppose," I said, "we must go round and pick up the track from the other side." He looked up and down the lane and smiled. "Would your quondam professor lose your respect for ever, Jardine, if you saw him climb over a fence in a frock coat and a topper?" "No," I answered, "but it might look a little quaint if anyone else saw you." "I think we will risk that," he said. "There's no one about, and I should rather like to try a little experiment. Would you mind if I hoisted you over the fence? You're something of an outsize, but then so am I too, which balances the conditions." Of course I had no objection, and, when we had looked up and down the lane and listened to make sure that we had no observers, Thorndyke picked me up, with an ease that rather surprised me, and hoisted me above the level of the fence. "Is it all clear on the other side?" he asked. "Yes," I answered. "There's no one in sight." "Then I want you to be quite passive," he said, and with this he hoisted me up further until I hung with my own weight across the top of the fence. Leaving me hanging thus, he sprang up lightly, and, having got astride at the top, dropped down on the other side, when he once more took hold of me and drew me over. "It wasn't so very difficult," he said. "Of course, it would have been more so to a shorter man, but, on the other hand, it is extremely unlikely that the body was anything like your size and weight." We now followed the track up to the wood, which we entered by an opening in the fence, through which I assumed that the murderer had probably passed. I conducted Thorndyke by the nearest route to the boat house, and, when he had thoroughly examined the place and made notes of the points that appeared to interest him, I showed him the way out by the turnstile. It was here, when we came in sight of the cottage, that I bethought me of my promise to Miss Vyne, and somewhat sheepishly explained the matter to Thorndyke. "It won't take me a minute to go in and sneak the things," I said apologetically, and was proposing that he should walk on slowly, when he interrupted me. "I'll come in with you," said he. "There may be something else to filch. Besides, I'm rather partial to empty houses. There is something quite interesting, I think, in looking over the traces of recent occupation and speculating on the personality and habits of the late occupiers. Don't you find it so?" I said yes, truthfully enough, for it was a feeling of this kind that had first led me to look over the cottage. But my interest was nothing to Thorndyke's, for no sooner had I let him in at the front door than he began to browse about through the empty rooms and passages, for all the world like a cat that had just been taken to a new house. "This was evidently the studio," he remarked, as we entered the room from which I had taken the canvas. "He doesn't seem to have had much of an outfit, as he appears to have worked on his sketching easel. You can see the indentations made by the toe points. There are no marks of the casters of a studio easel. You notice, too, that he sat on a camp stool to work." It did not appear to me to matter very much what he had sat on, but I kept this opinion to myself, and watched Thorndyke curiously as he picked up the empty paint tubes and scrutinized them one after the other. His inquisitiveness filled me with amused astonishment. He turned out the rubbish box completely, and having looked over every inch of the discarded canvases, he began systematically to examine, one by one, the pieces of paper on which the late resident had wiped his palette knife. Having rolled up and pocketed the waste canvases, I expressed myself as ready to depart. "If you're not in a hurry," said Thorndyke, "I should like to look over the rest of the premises." He spoke as though we were inspecting some museum or exhibition, and indeed his interest and attention, as he wandered from room to room, were greater than that of the majority of visitors to a public gallery. He even insisted on visiting the little stable and coach house, and when he had explored them both, ascended the rickety steps to the loft over the latter. "I suppose," said I, "this was the lumber room or store. Judging by the quantity of straw, it would seem as if some cases had been unpacked here." "Probably," agreed Thorndyke. "In fact, you can see where the cases have been dragged along, and also, by that smooth indented line, where some heavy metallic object has been slid along the floor. Perhaps if we look over the straw we may be able to judge what those cases contained." It didn't seem to me to matter a brass farthing what they contained, but again I made no remark, and together we moved the great mass of straw, almost handful by handful, from one end of the loft to the other, while Thorndyke not only examined the straw, but even closely scrutinized the floor on which it lay. As far as I could see, all this minute and apparently purposeless searching was entirely without result, until we were in the act of removing the last armful of straw from the corner, and even then the object that came to light did not appear a very remarkable one under the circumstances, though Thorndyke seemed to find what appeared to me a most unreasonable interest in it. The object was a pair of canvas pliers, which Thorndyke picked up almost eagerly and examined with profound attention. "What do you make of that, Jardine?" he asked at length, handing the implement to me. "It's a pair of canvas pliers," I replied. "Obviously," he rejoined. "But what do you suppose they have been used for?" I opined that they had been used for straining canvases, that being their manifest function. "But," objected Thorndyke, "he would hardly have strained his canvases up here. Besides, you will notice that they have, in fact, been used for something else. You observe that the handles are slightly bent, as if something had been held with great force, and if you look at the jaws, you will see that that something was a metallic object about 3/4 of an inch wide, with sharp corners. Now, what do you make of that?" I looked at the pliers, inwardly reflecting that I didn't care twopence what the object was, and finally said that I would give it up. "The problem does not interest you keenly," Thorndyke remarked with a smile, "and yet it ought to, you know. However, we may consider the matter on some future occasion. Meanwhile, I shall follow your pernicious example and purloin the pliers." His interest in this complete stranger appeared to me very singular, and it seemed for the moment to have displaced that in the mysterious case which was the object of his visit to me. "A strange, vagabond sort of man that artist must have been," he remarked as we walked home across the heath. "But I suppose one picks up vagabond habits in travelling about the world." "Do you gather that he travelled much, then?" I asked. "He appears to have visited New York, Brussels and Florence, which is a selection suggesting other travels." I was wondering vaguely how Thorndyke had arrived at these facts, and was indeed about to ask him, when he suddenly changed the subject by saying, "I suppose, Jardine, you don't wander about this place alone at night?" "I do sometimes," I replied. "Then I shouldn't," he said. "You must remember that a very determined attempt has been made on your life, and it would be unreasonable to suppose that it was made without some purpose. But that purpose is still unaccomplished. You don't know who your enemy is, and consequently can take no precautions against him excepting by keeping away from solitary places. It is an uncomfortable thought, but at present you have to remember that any chance stranger may be an intending murderer. So be on your guard." I promised to bear his warning in mind, though I must confess his language seemed to me rather exaggerated. And so we walked on, chatting about various matters until we arrived at my lodgings. Thorndyke was easily persuaded to come in and have tea with me, and while we were waiting for its arrival, he renewed his examination of the sketch upon the wall. "Aren't you going to have this strained on a stretcher?" he asked. I replied, "Yes, and that I intended to take it with me the next time I went into town." "Let me take it for you," said Thorndyke. "I should like to show it to Jervis to illustrate the route that we have marked on the map. Then I can have it left at any place that you like." I mentioned the name of an artist's colour man in the Hampstead Road, and, unpinning the canvas, rolled it up and handed it to him. He took it from me and, rolling it up methodically and carefully, bestowed it in his breast pocket. Then he brought forth the map, and as we drank our tea and talked over our investigations, he checked our route on it and marked the position of the cottage. Shortly after tea he took his leave, and I then occupied an agreeable half hour in composing a letter to Miss Vyne to accompany the loot from the deserted house. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of A Silent Witness by R.Austin Freeman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 10. The Unheeded Warning. Thorndyke's warning, so emphatically expressed, ought to have been alike unnecessary and effective. As a matter of fact, it was neither. I suppose that to a young man not naturally timorous, the idea of a constantly lurking danger amidst the prosaic conditions of modern civilization is one that is not readily accepted. At any rate, the fact is that I continued to walk abroad by day and by night with as much unconcern as if nothing unusual had ever befallen me. It was not that the recollection of those horrible hours in the poisoned cellar had in any way faded. That incident I could never forget. But I think that in the back of my mind there still lingered the idea of a homicidal lunatic, though that idea had been so scornfully rejected by Thorndyke. But before I describe the amazing experience by which I once more came within a hair's breadth of a sudden and violent death, I must refer to another incident, not because it seemed to be connected with that alarming occurrence, but because it came first in the order of time and had its own significance later. It was a couple of days after Thorndyke's visit that I walked down the Hampstead Road with the intention of fetching the sketch from the artist's colourman's. The shop was within a few hundred yards of Jacob Street, and as I crossed the end of that street I was just considering whether I ought to look in on Batson when a lady bowed to me and made as if she would stop. It was Mrs. Samway. Of course I stopped and shook hands, and while I was making the usual polite inquiries, I felt myself once more impressed with the unusualness of the woman. Even in her dress she was unlike other women, though not in the least eccentric or bizarre. At present she was clothed from head to foot in black, but a scarlet bird's wing in a coquettish little velvet toque and a scarlet bow at her throat gave an effect of colour that, unusual as it was, harmonized completely and naturally with her jet black hair and her strange, un-English beauty. "So you haven't started for Paris yet?" I remarked. "No," she replied. "My husband has gone and may perhaps come back. At any rate, I am staying in England for the present." "Then I may possibly have the pleasure of seeing you again," I said, and she graciously replied that she hoped it might be so, as we shook hands and parted. A few minutes later, in the artist's colourman's shop, I had another chance meeting and a more agreeable one. The proprietor had just produced the sketch, now greatly improved in appearance by being strained on a stretcher, when the glass door opened and a young lady entered the shop. Imagine my surprise when that young lady turned out to be none other than Miss Vyne. "Well," I exclaimed, as we mutually recognized each other, "what an extraordinary coincidence!" "I don't see that it is very extraordinary," she replied. "Most of the Hampstead people come here because it's the nearest place where you can get proper artist's materials. Is that the sketch you were telling me about?" "Yes," I answered, "and it's the pick of the loot. But it isn't too late to alter your mind. Say the word and it's yours." "Well," she replied with a smile, "I'm not going to say the word, but I want to thank you for rescuing those other treasures for me." She had, as a matter of fact, already thanked me in a very pretty little note, but I was not averse to her mentioning the subject again. We stepped back to the door, and in the brighter light looked at the sketch together. "It's a pity," she remarked, "that he handled it so carelessly before the paint was hard. Those finger marks wouldn't matter a bit on a brush painted surface, but on a smooth knife surface they're rather a disfigurement." She placed the sketch in my hand, and I backed nearer to the glass door to get a better light. Happening to glance up, I noticed that a sudden and very curious change had come over her, a look of haughty displeasure and even anger, apparently directed at somebody or something outside the shop. For a few moments I took no notice, then, half unconsciously, I looked round just as some person moved away from the door. I looked once more at Miss Vyne. She was quite unmistakably angry. Her cheeks were flushed, and there was a resentful light in her eyes that gave her an expression quite new to me. I suppose she caught my inquiring glance, for she exclaimed, "Did you see that woman? I never heard of such impertinence in my life." "What did she do?" I asked. "She came right up to the doorway and looked over your shoulder, and then stared at me in the most singular and insolent manner. I could have slapped her face." "Not through the glass door," I suggested, on which her anger subsided in a ripple of laughter as quickly as it had arisen. "What was this objectionable person like?" I asked. "Was she a charwoman or a slavey?" "Oh, not at all," replied Miss Vyne. "Quite a ladylike looking person, except for her manners. Rather tastefully dressed, too. A black and vermilion scheme of colour." The reply startled me a little. "Had she a scarlet bird's wing in her hat?" I asked. "Yes, and a scarlet bow at her throat. I hope you're not going to say that you know her?" It was a rather delicate situation. I could not actually disavow the acquaintance, but I did not feel inclined to have a black and scarlet fly introduced into the sweet-smelling ointment of my intercourse with the fair Sylvia; so I explained with great care the exact scope of the acquaintance, on which Miss Vyne remarked that she supposed that doctors could not be held responsible for the people they knew, and proceeded to make her purchases. I did not take the sketch away with me after all, for it occurred to me that I might as well leave it to be framed, but instead I carried forth with me the parcel containing Miss Vyne's purchases. I had not far to carry it, for she was returning at once to Hampstead. I was tempted to return, for the sake of enjoying a chat with her, too, but discreetly withstood the temptation, and, having escorted her to a tram, I turned my face south and walked away at a leisurely pace into the jaws of an all unsuspected danger. It was some hours, however, before anything remarkable happened. My immediate objective was Lincoln's Inn Fields, where, at the College of Surgeons, a lecture on epidermic appendages was to be delivered by the Hunterian professor; and there, in the college theatre, I spent a delightful hour while the genial professor took his hearers with him on a personally conducted tour among structures that ranged from the plumage of the sunbird to the dermal plates of the crocodile, from the silken locks of beauty to the quills of the porcupine or the mail of the armadillo. When I came out, the dusk was just closing in. It was a slightly foggy evening. The last glow of the sunset in the western sky lighted up the haze into a rosy background, against which the shadowy buildings were relieved in shapes of cloudy grey. It was a lovely effect, an effect such as London alone can show, and fugitive as a breath on a mirror. As I sauntered westward up the Strand, I presently bethought me that, before the light should have faded completely, I would see how the effect looked by the riverside. Walking quickly down Buckingham Street, I came out on to the Embankment and looked into the west. But the light was nearly gone, the shadows of evening were closing in fast, and the fog, creeping up the river, ushered in the night. I leaned on the parapet and watched the last glimmer die away; watched the darkness deepen on the river, and the faint lights on the barges moored on the southern shore at first twinkle pallidly and then fade out as the fog thickened. I lit my pipe and looked down at the dark water swirling past, and gradually fell into a train of half-dreamy meditation. Not for the first time since the occurrence, my thoughts turned to Mrs. Samway. Why had she stared at Miss Vyne in that singular manner? If indeed it was really Mrs. Samway, and if she really had stared in the manner alleged. It was an odd affair, but, after all, it did not very much matter. And with this my thoughts rambled off in a new direction. It was to the cottage on the Heath that they wandered this time, and the picture of Thorndyke's cat-like prowlings and pryings arose before me. That was very queer too. Was it possible that this learned and astute man habitually went about eagerly probing into the personal habits and trivial actions of chance strangers? The apparently puerile inquisitiveness that he displayed seemed totally out of character with all that I knew about the man. But then it often happens that the private life of public men develops personal traits that are surprising and disappointing to those who have only known them in connection with their public activities. I had become so completely immersed in my thoughts as to be almost oblivious of what was happening around. Indeed, there was mighty little happening. The gathering darkness and the thin fog limited my view to a few square yards. Now and again a muffled hoot from the lower river spoke of life and movement on the water, and at long intervals an occasional wayfarer would pass along the pavement behind me. My reflections had reached the point recorded above, when a person emerged from the obscurity near to the parapet and approached as if to pass close behind me. I only caught the dusky shape indistinctly with the tail of my eye, so indistinctly that I could not say certainly whether it was that of a man or a woman, for I was still gazing down at the dark water. He or she approached quietly, swerving towards me across the wide pavement, and was in the act of passing quite close to me when the thing happened. Of a sudden I felt my knees clasped in a powerful grip, and at the same moment I was lifted off my feet and thrust forward over the parapet. Instinctively I clutched at the stonework, but its flat surface offered nothing for my fingers to grasp. Then my assailant let go, and the next instant I plunged head first into the icy water. It was fortunate for me that the tide was nearly full, else must I, almost certainly, have broken my neck. As it was, my head struck on the firm mud at the bottom with such force that for some moments I was half stunned. Nevertheless, I must have struck out automatically, for when I began to recover my wits, my head was above water and I was swimming as actively as my clinging garments would let me. But apparently, in those moments of dazed semi-consciousness, I must have struck out towards the middle of the river, for now I was encompassed by a murky void in which nothing was visible save one or two reddish, luminous patches, presumably the lamps on the embankment. Towards one of these I turned and struck out vigorously. The water was desperately cold, and hampered as I was with my clothing, I felt that I should not be able to keep myself afloat very long, strong swimmer as I was. The dim red nebula of the unseen lamps moved past slowly, showing me that I was drifting down on the ebb tide. Before me, I knew, was the long, inhospitable wall of the embankment. True, there were some steps, if I was not mistaken, by Cleopatra's Needle, but the question was whether I had not drifted past them already. I had given one or two lusty shouts as soon as I had cleared my chest of the mouthful of water that I had got in my first plunge, and I was now letting off another yell, when, out of the darkness behind me, came a prolonged hoot. I looked round quickly in the direction whence the sound had come, and then became aware of the churning of a propeller. Almost at the same moment, a dim, ruddy smudge of light broke through the darkness over the river, and began rapidly to brighten until it took the form of the twin masthead lights of a tug with a vessel in tow. For a moment I hesitated. My first impulse was to avoid the danger of being run down, but suddenly I altered my mind, for as the tug bore down on me with a roaring of water and a loud clank of machinery, I saw that she was not absolutely end on, for her green starboard light, which had been for a moment visible, suddenly disappeared. Of what happened during the next few moments I have but a confused recollection. A splashing and churning, with a loud wash of water, the throb of the engines, and a glare of light which blazed before my eyes for a moment, to vanish in an instant into pitchy darkness. A huge black object, felt rather than seen, to sweep past before me. And then my hand clutched a wooden projection, and I felt myself dragged violently through the water. The projection that I had laid hold of was the lee board of a sailing barge, as I discovered when the rush of the water banged me against it, and much ado I had to hold on, with the water dragging at me and spouting up over my head. But with what strength was left to me, I reached out with the other hand and clawed hold of the dwarf bulwark over which the water was lapping, and so, with a last violent effort, contrived to drag myself up onto the deck. I essayed to stand up, and did in fact succeed, but as my sensations suggested those of a leaden statue with india rubber legs, I sat down hastily on the hatch cover to avoid going overboard. And there I sat for a minute or two, leaning against the lowered mast with my teeth chattering, and seeming to grow more and more chilled and exhausted every moment. Numb as my mind was by this time, my medical instincts told me that this would not do. Somehow I must get warmth and shelter, for I might as well have been drowned at once as die of exposure and cold. I looked round lethargically. There was no sign of anyone on board. Another barge was towing alongside, and the bows of two others were dimly visible astern. On those rearmost barges there must certainly have been someone steering. But they were inaccessible to me, and I had not the energy to shout, nor could anyone have got across to me if I had. Suddenly my eye fell on the little chimney that rose by the cabin scuttle. A thin stream of smoke issued from it and blew away astern. Perhaps, then, the crew were below, or, if not, at least there was a fire. I crawled aft, holding on with my hands, and, pushing back the scuttle, backed cautiously down the ladder, closing the scuttle after me. There seemed to be nobody below, and the cabin was in darkness, save for the glow of the fire that burned in the little grate. The air was probably warm, though to me it felt icy; but at least there was no wind to play on my wet clothes. I sat down on the locker as near to the fire as I could, and rested my elbows on the little triangular table. Chilled to the marrow, and utterly exhausted, I was sensible of a growing desire to sleep, a desire which I repressed, as I believed, with noble resolution. But apparently my efforts in this respect were not so successful as I had supposed, for the next incident opened with suspicious suddenness. A vigorous shake, which dislodged one of my elbows, introduced the episode. I looked up, blinking sulkily at a bright and most objectionably dazzling light, which further inspection showed to proceed from a hurricane lamp held by a rather dirty hand. "Here, wake up, mister," said a hoarse voice. "This here ain't the Hotel Cecil, you know." I sat up and stared vaguely at the speaker, or at least the holder of the lamp, but could not think of anything appropriate to say. Then another voice emerged from nowhere in particular. "He's been overboard, that's what he's been." "Any fool can see that," said the first man. "But the question is, who is he and what's he doing in my cabin? Who are you, mister?" Now, that would seem to be a perfectly simple and straightforward question. But it is not so simple as it seems. To a complete stranger, the bare mention of a name is unilluminating. Further explanations are needed, and at that moment I did not feel equal to explanations. Besides, I was not so very clear on the subject myself. Consequently, I preserved a silence which, perhaps, was wooden rather than golden. "The ear," persisted the first man. "I'm asking you a question." "What's the good of asking questions of a man what's been a-ramming his crumpet against the bottom of the river?" protested the other man. "What do you mean?" demanded the first mariner. "Can't you see?" retorted the other. "As he's took the ground hard. Look at his head." Here the first mariner, Lucifer or lamp bearer, wiped his hand over the top of my head and then examined the tip of his forefinger critically, as though it were the arming of a deep-sea lead. "You're right, Abel," said he. "That's mud off the bottom, that is. He must have took a regular header. Suicide, perhaps, and altered his mind. Found it a bit damper than what he expected. Put the kettle on, Abe." From this moment the two mariners treated me as if I had been a lay figure. Silently they peeled off my wet clothes and dried my skin with vigorous friction as if it had been a wet deck. They not only asked no further questions, but when I would have spoken they urged me to economize my wind. They inducted me into stiff and hairy garments of uncouth aspect, and finally Abe set before me on the table a large earthenware mug, the contents of which steamed and diffused through the cabin a strong odour of Dutch gin. "You get outside that, mister," said the luminiferous mariner, who turned out subsequently to be the skipper, "and then you'd best turn in." The treatment was not strictly orthodox, but I obeyed without demur. Most people would have done the same under the circumstances. But the process of getting outside it took time, for the grog was boiling hot and had been brewed with a flexible wrist. By the time that I had emptied the mug, I was not only revived, but, so far as my memory serves, rather disposed to be garrulously explanatory and facetious. I even felt a slight inclination to sing. But my friends would stand no nonsense. As soon as the mug was fairly empty, they bundled me, neck and crop, into a sort of elongated cupboard, and proceeded to pile on me untold quantities of textile fabrics, including a complete suit of oilskins. Then they commanded me to go to sleep, which I believe I must have done almost instantly. End of chapter 10.